Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this segment of Citizen Voice, True U.S. History. We are grateful that you could tune in, grateful for WCN hosting us on their channel through live streaming effort, and for the sponsors through Citizen Sentinel Network. We hope that people can take some time out of their busy day to check out some of the information that we're sharing. The information that we're opposing is pretty much narrative and not history. This is why I call this segment the True U.S. History. So in this segment, and in all the segments up to this point, we're still not in true U.S. history because we're not at the point in time in which the United States of America came into existence. The reality is that the American name is used quite frequently to associate with the United States of America. And it's done in some ways innocently, in some ways naively, some ways it's done deceptively. And so the concept of the 1619 Project is to convey the idea that this was all the United States of America, when in fact, this was a British colonial experience up until the time the colonies rebelled against Great Britain and made it the United States of America. That happened officially in 1783. And in essence, even that government that we had in 1783 is not the government we have today. Today, we are based on the Constitution that was created in 1787. And even now, the government that was created in 1787 under the United States Constitution is not the government that we have today. So all of these things have essential consequences. When you don't follow the rules, when you don't follow the law, when you don't obey, you face consequences. Unfortunately, we have a group of people today that don't really have any consequences in disobeying the law or the law of the land, the Constitution. How do we get there? Well, part of the reason that we got there, you have to look back into history. And so we're willing to look back in the time that the 1619 Project examines history, but we come up with completely different conclusions based on history, not based on a narrative from Nicole Hannah-Jones or from the New York Times, which is a journalistic endeavor. So this is one of the reasons why we had William Federer on last week, and I'm sorry if people missed that interview with William Federer. And it's hard for somebody like him who understands so much history to compact it into, say, less than a half an hour. So we will try to get William Federer back to help us understand more different segments and actually of United States history, not just British colonial history. So going back to what we were talking about with William Federer, we talked a little bit about how at some point in time, there was a desperate effort for the British to send more people over to the New World. Now, if you're the Spanish king, you just do it by telling people there's gold over there, and you get a lot of people who are interested in wealth to jump on ships and come across the ocean. We talked about Columbus as being one of the first gold rushes in European history across the Atlantic to the New World. Well, in some ways, the British were trying to do the same thing. This flyer that you see here that we showed during the time in which we interviewed Bill Federer, it was a travel flyer, basically encouraging people to come across the Atlantic to this colony. Now, the problem is that reality differed from what was put into this flyer. The colony was struggling and, in essence, under attack from Indians and starving. People were dying. They really didn't like doing what they were doing. And what were they doing? Well, many of the people, and perhaps the major contingents of people that came across, were indentured servants. And that's called slavery by any other term. I mean, we can talk about the, semantics of that. They did get to go free at some point in time after 5 to 7 years, but a lot of people don't realize as they indentured themselves, put themselves under contract to be a slave, essentially they went across the ocean, they got sick, and they died before they got the reward, which would mean, maybe a 5-year to 7-year period of servitude. And then you might get your freedom at that point. You got your passage coming across the ocean on the ship that was contracted by these venture capitalists. Or in some cases, like in Maryland, they would give people 50 acres of land after they finish their servitude. Well, in this same way, this was all run not by the King of England, but it was run by venture capitalists. It was run by the Virginia Company. And I mean, truly run by the Virginia Company. Now, the unfortunate reality is that you have the Virginia Company in England and the Jamestown effort going on in North America. And so there's an incredible disconnect. It's a disconnect that Thomas Jefferson referred to after the United States was actually formed. He said, how can you expect, somebody in the capital city of Washington, D.C. to know what's going on in the farms of Pennsylvania or farther out in other parts of the country that were just beginning to form? He understood centralized authority did not necessarily work. Yet, we have a population in the United States right now really enamored with centralized authority. We have a president of the United States who is enamored with centralized authority. We have many governors across the country who are enamored and flex their muscle through their centralized authority. Well, what was the authority back at that time of the Jamestown colony? It was a business enterprise. And essentially, what are we looking at today? We're looking at woke corporations who are trying to flex their muscle. And what do corporations really, how do they operate? Centralized authority. It's not based on freedom. It's not based on the democracy that people have in their minds of what that is. So you have to get in your consciousness that what was happening, what was really the seeds of this country that we eventually evolved into the United States. The seeds were basically planted here in Virginia, and it was a venture capitalist enterprise. And what that means is that they were looking for a return on their investment. They were looking for the wealth that could be extracted from the colony. Now, these people who were running this were wealthy people. And the people who actually gained prominence in Virginia initially were the people who could make a go of it. Now, how did they make a go of it? Well, they came across on ships like this, and they came to the New World. Now, this is how Captain John Smith got here. So Captain John Smith essentially was one of the first individuals, and I was explaining just before we started talking directly to Bill Federer, and actually I was very happy that he could give such a background of Captain John Smith. Many people don't know that Captain John Smith was a slave at one point in time, but also many people didn't know that John Smith, as he came across the Atlantic, was made a prisoner by the people on that first journey. And he was a prisoner. And when they opened the box to let people know who was going to be on the ruling council, and this was appointed by the Virginia Company, John Smith was on the list of one of the people who were going to be the council members, but they refused to let him out of captivity. So it wasn't until the minister who was along on the journey, he persuaded the council, look, this is what the Virginia Company want, and you should honor that. But there was already this rebellion that existed within the ranks of the people who are supposedly the leaders. And this intrigue, this political intrigue, actually went on a long time in Virginia. And it wasn't until probably 1608, after I would say most of the early council members had died, that John Smith eventually became the president of the colony. So not only was he the first historian of the Jamestown colony, but he was also the president for a period of time, about a little over a year, from 1608 to 1609. So John Smith was the pioneer who essentially helped the village, or what we can say is Jamestown, stay alive. Now, there's a picture of a Susquehannock chieftain here that I wanted to focus in on. But the overall reality is that going back to the days of Columbus, and you can see the picture with Columbus here looking at the Taino, he discovered that the Taino had scars all over their body because they didn't wear much clothing. And he wondered, and he tried to ascertain, why are there scars? And he realized over a period of time, the Taino were not the only Indian tribe in the area. They were not the only guys in the neighborhood. There was not only the Taino, but the Arawaks, and also what the Caribbean is named after, the Caribbeans, the Carib Indians. So the Caribs were the dominant Indian tribe in the area, and they enslaved the Taino, and they tortured them and did all kinds of, mutilating types of efforts. And so these people were pretty brutal. Now, this Susquehannock chieftain here that we are going to look at for just a bit, this person was a chief among all of the other Indian people, and ultimately he had a command of a number of Indians around him. Now, the ultimate is that they did what the chieftain said. So you also have a centralized authority through the chief of the Indians in this period of time. However, what seemed to be the Indian way was also something that there was a leeway or some degree of latitude that the Indians had. And we're going to talk about this in a bit. But historians really have trouble understanding this. But the reality is that John Smith and all the people that were in Jamestown had to deal with the Indians. But dealing with the Indians was pretty much under the direction of the Virginia Company, who essentially only had remote reports about what was going on. And this is a point of contention not only between Smith and the Virginia Company, but also the previous leaders before Smith, the ones who took their orders directly from the Virginia Company. However, when we see Smith trying to interact and obtain food from the Indians, one of the first things that we understand is that the Pamunkeys captured John Smith in that first year. Toward the end of 1607, Smith was captured. He was taken captive, and there's a picture here of them celebrating. They had captured the leader supposedly of this colony, but he was not the leader at that point. He was just a point man trying to help the colony to survive by getting food from the Indians, which other people were willing to steal, and then creating tension among the Indians. Smith had a different way of doing it. He just walked into their areas and demanded that they give him food, usually in a very forceful way. You can understand that Smith, being a soldier, and his background that Bill Federer talked about last time, fighting in the Middle East, the overall situation is that he had a very strong confidence in his own abilities, and especially in the abilities of his firearms. So when the Pamunkeys captured Smith, they were going to do to him pretty much what they did to any of the intruders. And normally they would, tie them to a tree, and they would chop their limbs off and then throw the limbs into the fire. They did this to one of the people that was on one of the journeys that Smith was, taking at one point in time to trade with the Indians. So the stories of John Smith, possibly embellished a little bit by him, but he had to deal with these people. Another journey of John Smith up the river, they came to an area where there was another chieftain, Kanaga, and the chieftain was trying to be nice to John Smith. John Smith didn't trust him. The overall reality is that he was being challenged by hundreds of Indians that had surrounded his small party of men. And so Smith came up with the idea, you and I, let's go mano to mano, and we'll fight it out between the two of us. And the chieftain was trying to be nice. He said, I meant no harm, let's be peaceful here. But Smith became very anxious at this point in time. The Indians were closing in. And so he grabbed the guy by his hair, his long hair ponytail, and held a gun to his head. And this has been depicted in this picture that we're showing here now. But what Smith was trying to do was to save himself and to save his men from annihilation at this point. So the Indians were a very hostile environment to deal with. Not only survival just based on planting food and trying to grow crops that would turn to food, but the overall reality is that there was an internal situation of the people not wanting to do any work. Some of these people who were indentured servants would be doing the work, but many of them had this internal attitude that, why need to do any work? We can let Smith do the trading for us and he will get, the food. But Smith ultimately had to lay the law down. And in his efforts of what he was trying to do, Smith essentially was trying to keep the colony alive. But we come to a point in which they capture him and they're going to kill Captain John Smith. Now, this is before he was president. And ultimately, he was the guy who was trying to procure the food for the people in the fort. Now, this is an entry in his journal where they are going to kill him. And the chieftain's son, Powhatan's daughter, was probably about 12 years old. The historians believe that she was maybe 12 years old at this point in time. And she intervened in saving John Smith. So this is where Pocahontas comes into the picture here. She takes an active role, and Smith is not talking about a romantic relationship with Pocahontas here at this point. He's basically talking about how she persuaded her father to save his life. So what we have is this interplay. You obviously have a daughter, and some of the Indians could maybe negotiate with the chieftain over the centralized authority that he wielded at this point. So the bottom line is that Pocahontas saves his life. And in this period, Smith then is permitted to go back to the colony and continue to build the foundation of Jamestown. Now, the real question is, why? Why was he allowed? And historians still don't know, and they speculate. And there's no real, it's okay to speculate, but there's no real truth to it. You have Disney coming out with a Pocahontas story in which John Smith and Pocahontas were involved romantically, but there is no real truth to it. It's not coming from John Smith's journal. What comes from John Smith's journal is his gratitude to have life, his ability to continue to go forward in this experiment that we call Jamestown. So Smith is able to go back. If we look at the fort, the overall situation of James Fort here, it was at this point in time just a fledgling colony, barely able to survive. However, in 1608, Smith is named the president. They had a vote, and while one of the occasions that happened while Smith was out is that a former leader of the colony tried to take over, and he was put in prison for mutiny. And they then elected John Smith because he was the guy that was more proactive and seemed to have the ability to provide the food that they needed by going out and demanding it from the Indians. But this in and of itself created tension. The stealing from the Indians created tension. And so on different occasions, when Smith was out, sometimes the Indians would invade, and sometimes they would kill the settlers there. This situation in James Fort, and initially it was a fort. We call it Jamestown because it eventually attracted more colonists, and the expansion of the area, then it becomes a town. And ultimately what happens is that the governor is based inside the fort because that's where the centralized authority is. So I showed last time with the governor's parlor, the governor's house, his home, not elaborate, very stark type of situation. There are pictures of his home, inside the hall there of his home, his bedchamber. It's all very stark. But one of the interesting things is Powhatan wanted a house built like that house because he had been there. He had seen, the governor's home, and, he felt that that was fitting for the chieftain, right? So Powhatan asked John Smith to loan him the use of 40 men. And then he wanted, a bunch of swords, and he wanted a number of other, things that the Europeans could give to him. And Smith felt, he's not going to give him any weapons, and he would try to give him, what he wanted in terms of, the manpower to build the home. But in this process, in the process of trying to do what the Indians were asking, so that he could lay a better foundation of friendship, the people that he sent to help the chief became counter spies. And ultimately he was, Smith was relying on these people. There were a few Dutchmen and I think a Polish person that he sent among these, 40 people to go and help build this house. But these people realized the colony is starving to death. We're not sure if we're going to survive. So Smith is in a situation where he has people who are against him. It's like the deep state. They were on the side of the enemy, the Indian, and they made contracts with the Indians. And Powhatan then basically told them, go back and steal the swords that Smith does not want to give to me. You have a situation here that's much more complex than most people truly understand. And then ultimately what we see is that Europe starts calling the shots. Old Europe then, especially England, but you have these people from different countries coming. It wasn't all English people. As I said, that he was relying on, a Polish person. He was relying on some Dutchmen, and they turned on him. He was the Englishman. So you have the infighting amongst the people from different countries because they don't trust each other within the Jamestown colony. We have this impression that everything was all hunky-dory and they were all Englishmen. That's not true. It wasn't the case at all. Smith had to deal with people who were counter spies within his own group of people that he felt he could trust. And the people back in England, the people that were running the Virginia Company, were influenced by other people who wanted to see Jamestown taken over by other elements. They didn't trust Smith. They didn't like Smith and the way he was dealing with it. And at one point, the Virginia Company said, you need to start appeasing the Indians. You need to start dealing with them in a way in which you're not so, heavy-handed. And Smith, he became a person who was really torn by the politics of what was going on between the, what he experienced in real life with the Indians, dealing with them on a daily basis, and the orders that were coming from across the Atlantic. Now, in this environment, one of the governors purchases slaves. Now, what was it? Well, okay, so first of all, Smith is out of the picture. 10 years previous to the purchase of the slaves, John Smith has a gunpowder accident in 1609, and he goes back to England. But he's probably happy that he's out of there. He didn't want to be in that kind of situation anymore. In 1609, also, John Rolfe comes across the ocean, and there's a Shakespeare's play, The Tempest. That play was based off of the ship being shipwrecked that John Rolfe happened to be on. Now, the captain of that ship, and we talked a little bit about this before, is called the Sea Venture. The captain of that ship was the admiral, an admiral, and he managed to land the ship on the land there in the Caribbean. But because of that, the people were stranded. They had to stay there. They had to wait for another ship to come. So the trade at this point in time in the Caribbean, much of it was tobacco and slaves. And so the English in 1609 didn't really deal with slaves, but the Spanish had a colony there, a slave colony, and perhaps more than one. So John Rolfe took seeds from tobacco and transplanted that into Virginia, into the Virginian soil. And tobacco took off. So in 1609, Rolfe goes into Virginia. His wife and child die in the Caribbean. And so he is the one that marries Pocahontas initially. Eventually. Pocahontas was married to an Indian brave before she was married to John Rolfe. But he plants tobacco, and this becomes a successful crop. The cash crop saves Jamestown. Ultimately, this is a cash crop in which most of the indentured servants had to dealing with the planting and harvesting of tobacco at that point. Then you see this importation of slaves because the indentured servants have enough problems as they face this new world. Many of them are dying before they receive their freedom. And many of them are disgruntled by the heavy-handed ways in which the Jamestown colony is run, basically through the governors who are appointed by the Virginia colony, the Virginia Company. So in this case, you have slaves there before the slaves are imported from Africa. And most people don't really comprehend this. Indentured servitude was slavery. And in many cases, it was slavery that ultimately led to your death. It worked you to a point where you really had no dignity and no good health. And there are quotes from people who were indentured servants who really did not like the situation that they were in at that point. And one of the problems that comes up later in the Jamestown colony is Bacon's Rebellion. So you have the slaves being introduced in this hostile environment, which is another issue entirely. So we are going to talk more specifically about this at a later point. We're going to pick this up next week on Memorial Day. We hope to have Earl Wallace back, and he's going to give us another perspective on the biblical basis of the Bill of Rights. We hope that you can join us again next time on Memorial Day, but obviously if you have other plans, we will understand. But we pray that you can join us when you're able. We want to thank Wisconsin Christian News for allowing us to be live streamed into their programs. And we thank you for tuning in and donating to Citizen Sentinel Network. Take care. God bless.